Imagine a typical winter in the year 1340 when temperatures drop well below freezing. You are standing on a snow-covered hill looking at two very different dwellings. On one side stands a majestic castle worth $1 billion by today's standards. On the other side is a pitiful peasant hut worth barely more than $1.
It seems obvious which of the inhabitants will spend this winter in warmth and absolute comfort.
But here, history presents us with the first surprising and completely illogical surprise. All our modern logic literally screams that enormous wealth always guarantees safety and comfort. We are used to thinking that thick stone walls automatically mean a luxurious and warm life. However, the harsh laws of physics worked differently in the Middle Ages, paying no attention to noble titles. A powerful lord in his giant castle could be chattering his teeth from the piercing cold, while an ordinary peasant slept peacefully in the warmth. To understand this paradox, we have to forget all the fairy tale myths about beautiful royal palaces.
Today, we will take a detailed look at how people survived in extreme conditions and why $1 billion could not buy basic warmth.
Let's start our analysis with the cheapest housing that could be built in those harsh historical times. Peasant huts were literally built from whatever could be found in the nearest forest or field. The frame was made of thin poles, and the walls were molded from clay generously mixed with ordinary straw. These materials seem laughable compared to the powerful castle stone, but they work perfectly. Clay and straw created excellent natural insulation, completely preventing precious heat from escaping into the cold street. But the main secret of peasant survival was not architecture at all, but a unique biological heating system. When the first real frost set in, life in a medieval village changed dramatically and rapidly. People didn't just lock themselves tightly in their fragile homes. They took all their livestock with them. Cows, grunting pigs, and skittish sheep spent the winter under the same roof as their caring owners. You could sleep with a huge live cow peacefully chewing hay just 2 meters from your face. It sounds like a modern city dweller's nightmare, but back then it was a matter of basic survival in winter. Why did adults and sane people resort to such extreme measures during the coldest time of the year? The answer lies in simple biology and the laws of thermodynamics, which ordinary peasants understood intuitively. Large domestic animals generate a tremendous amount of heat simply through their daily activities. Modern scientists have calculated that one adult cow works like a heater with a power of about 1,000 watts. Imagine that you have a powerful, modern electric fireplace constantly running in a small room. 2 cows and a dozen sheep could easily and effortlessly heat a small hut, even in the most severe frost. Of course, such an effective living battery had one huge and very specific domestic drawback. The smell in such a closed room was simply unbelievable because the animals defecated directly on the earthen floor. An ordinary modern person would hardly be able to stay in such a hut for more than 5 minutes without feeling nauseous. But for a peasant, this heavy smell meant only one thing. His family would definitely not freeze to death that night. Choosing between a painful death from hypothermia and the stench of fresh manure, the choice was obvious.
Here we encounter a true symbiosis between humans and wildlife in the most extreme living conditions.
Animals saved freezing people with their warmth, and people reliably protected animals from hungry wolves. Leaving livestock outside meant losing all your property forever and condemning your family to certain starvation. In those harsh times, a cow was not just a source of milk, it was a real guarantee of your life. Animals were treated with great respect, fairly sharing the common roof over their heads with them. It was an amazing team effort where each participant contributed to the common cause of survival. Today, we spend huge amounts of money every month on modern gas heating bills. We carefully insulate our walls with the latest materials and install very sophisticated smart thermostats in our homes. 700 years ago, a similar problem was solved simply by having another well-fed grunting pig. Your living peasant heater not only provided warmth, but also produced valuable spring fertilizer for the fields. Try right now to get your modern white radiator to provide the same comprehensive, intangible benefits.
Archaeologists often find the remains of such old houses and are genuinely amazed at their incredible ingenuity.
The entire interior layout was strictly subordinated to a single goal: to preserve every degree of precious heat. Animals served not only as farm livestock, but as a vital technological element of the building's infrastructure. This completely shatters our arrogant view of the stupid and completely uneducated people of the dark past. They were true survival geniuses, using scarce resources with maximum efficiency, bordering on the fantastic. The biological battery worked flawlessly for months on end, requiring neither coal nor complex maintenance. But warm animals were only one important part of this complex medieval system of sustaining human life. At the very center of any room was always the heart of the home, without which winter would instantly become fatal. The ordinary hearth played a vital role not only as a kitchen stove, but also as the main source of intense heat. The way peasants skillfully handled open fire deserves a separate and very detailed historical discussion. Let's see why their primitive earthen hearth was much more efficient than the huge and luxurious royal fireplaces. In the very center of a cramped peasant hut, there was always an open stone, or simply earthen hearth. The smoke from this fire went straight through a small hole specially made in the thatched roof of the building. At first glance, such an engineering design sounds incredibly primitive, and even a little scary to us. It seems like just a random fire that was lit for some reason right in the middle of the living room on the floor. But in fact, it was the pinnacle of heating efficiency for a small enclosed rural space. Such an open fire radiated life-saving heat in all directions around it. The location of the fire, strictly in the geometric center of the room, was chosen by the peasants for a reason. Thanks to this, the powerful heat was evenly distributed throughout the entire area of the hut, leaving no cold, dead corners. The whole large family could gather closely around the fire, forming a perfect circle of warmth, safety, and comfort. Modern wall radiators usually hang on only one side, heating the space extremely unevenly and inefficiently. The peasants, on the other hand, got the absolute maximum heat output from every dry log burned in their home. Of course, an open and powerful fire in the middle of a living room constantly posed a huge mortal danger. Village houses were built of extremely flammable materials, and a single accidental spark could destroy the entire village. But people were well aware of this daily risk and always treated fire with incredible caution and respect. A reliable barrier of stones was often laid around the hearth to prevent the accidental spread of the voracious flames. From an early age, small children were strictly taught to respect the fire and never play too close to it. It was a very harsh time when the slightest mistakes were punished not with a monetary fine, but with the loss of all one's possessions. Interestingly, the simple earthen floor of the hut excellently accumulated excess heat from the burning central hearth.
During the long day, the damp earth warmed up so much that it continued to give off pleasant heat even on a deep, frosty night.
In essence, illiterate peasants successfully used the principle of heat capacity long before the advent of modern energy-efficient passive houses. They turned the very foundation of their homes into a huge, free, and very reliable passive battery. In rich castles, however, the icy stone floors worked in exactly the opposite way, greedily drawing the last remnants of heat from the feet of the aristocrats. The hole in the roof for the acrid smoke to escape also had its own clever design features and historical secrets. It was not just a huge hole through which autumn rain poured in, unhindered, and winter snow fell. A small protective canopy made of branches was often built over it to reliably shield the fire from direct precipitation. The warm air from the central fire created a very powerful draft, physically preventing the cold wind from entering the house. It worked like an invisible heat gun, powerfully pushing the smoke straight into the dark, frosty sky. Surprisingly simple but ingenious aerodynamics saved thousands of people from freezing in the most terrible blizzards.
But this incredible and life-saving thermal efficiency came at a very high and terrible physical cost.
The central fire warmed frozen bodies perfectly, but at the same time slowly and surely destroyed the health of all the inhabitants of the hut. The harsh physics of combustion are inevitable, And along with life-giving heat, the fire produced a huge amount of suffocating byproducts. This problem was so serious and widespread that it still leaves a clear mark on the skeletons of medieval people. And now we inevitably move on to the darkest, most dangerous, and unpleasant aspect of life in a peasant's house. The effective peasant hut had one truly enormous and destructive drawback: a complete lack of normal ventilation. In order to preserve the precious heat from the fire and animals, the house had to be made as airtight and closed as possible. Because of this, all the acrid smoke from the open hearth could not quickly and freely escape into the cold street. As a result, the upper half of the living space was constantly filled with thick, gray, and highly toxic smog. Living in such a house in winter meant many months of continuously breathing air filled with dangerous combustion products. Wintering in a peasant family was like an endless stay in a modern room for aggressive smoking. Because of this heavy, constant smoke inside the house, peasants suffered en masse from severe chronic respiratory diseases. Their lungs were black with ingrained soot, as if they had worked their entire lives in a deep coal mine. A constant suffocating cough was an absolutely normal and familiar background sound in any medieval village of that time. Modern doctors would be horrified to see the toxic conditions in which peasant children grew up. But at that time, no one understood the connection between smoke and lung disease, considering coughing to be a normal part of winter. In addition to destroying the lungs, the thick smoke dealt an irreparable and cruel blow to the eyesight of all the inhabitants of the hut. Caustic ash particles constantly got into their eyes, causing severe chronic inflammation and profuse tearing. By the age of 40, many peasants began to rapidly lose their eyesight, and some went completely blind from constant irritation of the retina. Archaeologists studying medieval skulls often find characteristic changes in the bones around the eye sockets, caused by years of severe infection. People literally burn their eyes just to keep from freezing to death on cold winter nights. But why not just build a normal brick chimney, as the wealthy lords did in their castles? The answer, as always in the harsh medieval history, is extremely simple and boils down to huge amounts of money. Building a stone chimney required hiring a professional mason and purchasing very expensive building materials.
For an ordinary peasant living off the land, such astronomical expenses were completely unrealistic and impossible.
Therefore, they had to pay for free heat every day with their own health and life expectancy. It is very difficult for modern people to comprehend the full scale of this daily and inevitable environmental disaster in miniature. We complain about the slight smell of exhaust fumes on the street, demanding the installation of modern filters in factories. But people in the past voluntarily locked themselves in a gas chamber for 6 months just to live to see the warm spring. Your modern survival requires only the timely payment of a small bill for clean electricity or gas. The survival of a peasant required a willingness to cough up blood and slowly go blind in exchange for basic physical warmth. Life expectancy in those days was depressingly low, and not just because of wars or the terrible plague. Millions of people quietly died in their homes from complications after common respiratory infections, exacerbated by constant smoke. Smoky lungs simply could not effectively fight even the most common and mild winter cold. The price of survival in the moment meant a slow and painful decline of the body over the long term. It was a cruel but absolutely inevitable biological compromise that entire generations of our ancestors agreed to.
This whole situation clearly demonstrates how narrow and dangerous the corridor of survival was in the Middle Ages.
Any effective solution, such as lighting a fire in the center of a cramped room, immediately created a new deadly threat. People constantly balanced on a razor's edge between instant death from cold and slow death from smoke. And in this harsh historical context, their choice in favor of immediate warmth seems absolutely logical and justified. Clean lungs are completely useless to the dead, so the fire continued to burn and the smoke continued to suffocate. However, smoke was far from the only problem preventing a normal and healthy life inside a peasant hut. In addition to the lack of normal clean air, people suffered from a total shortage of another vital resource: sunlight. Retaining heat required maximum insulation of the room from the street, which led to very unusual architectural solutions. We will talk in detail about how peasants solved the problem of windows and lighting in the next amazing chapter. Believe me, their ingenuity in this difficult matter will surprise you again. In today's comfortable world, we don't think twice about something as mundane as ordinary window glass. Huge panoramic windows are now found in almost every new house, and they are relatively inexpensive. But in the harsh, classical Middle Ages, a piece of clear glass was an incredible, almost fairy tale luxury for the select few. Glass was so prohibitively expensive that an ordinary peasant could not afford to buy it even in his entire lifetime. Therefore, to protect against the cold wind, the tiny openings in huts had to be covered with completely different, affordable materials. The simplest and most obvious solution was to make the window openings as small and inconspicuous as possible from the outside. With the onset of winter, these small holes in the walls were simply plugged tightly with thick bundles of dry straw or old rags. Sometimes rough wooden shutters were hung on the outside, which were closed tightly at the slightest hint of a strong, icy wind. This helped to keep the precious heat inside, but created a new huge domestic problem for all the inhabitants. The house was plunged into complete, frightening darkness, even on the clearest and sunniest winter day. Such a horn window was completely opaque in our modern understanding of this familiar word. You couldn't admire the beautiful winter landscape through it, or watch your neighbors walking down the street. But that was not necessary, because the main task was completely different: to let a little sunlight in. The horn plates perfectly transmitted a dim yellowish light, creating a strange, mystical atmosphere inside the room. This light was barely enough to avoid tripping over a pig and to distinguish a bowl of soup from a sleeping child. If it was too much trouble to deal with hard horns, there was another popular and simpler alternative. Instead of horns, a piece of thick parchment or a dried animal bladder was stretched tightly over the wooden window frame. To make this material more transparent and prevent it from getting wet in the first rain, it was generously soaked in animal fat. The oiled parchment also let in a little daylight and provided fairly good protection from the piercing, icy wind. However, dogs and rats often gnawed through these tasty, greasy windows, leaving their owners with a huge hole in the wall.
He is growing strong.
Just imagine the level of this incredible domestic discomfort by today's standards. In winter, you sit in a cramped hut filled with acrid smoke and the persistent smell of a dozen domestic animals. Your main source of light is a cow's stomach, stretched over sticks or pieces of boiled horns. Modern people would fall into a deep depression at the mere thought of such a way of life. But the peasants were genuinely happy, even with such a meager ray of light shining through a cloudy yellow horn. This historical fact clearly shows how huge the gap between the classes was in those harsh times. While rich lords decorated their castle chapels with stained glass windows, the poor boiled bones to see the sun. The most basic things that we take for granted today required incredible physical and mental effort back then. The engineering of survival forced people to use literally every part of a slaughtered animal, leaving no waste. A cow not only provided life-saving warmth and food, but also served as a window to the outside world. Despite all these tricks, there was always a catastrophic lack of light in peasant homes throughout the long winter. The days became very short, and the faint glow of the fire did not allow for complex or delicate work. Therefore, the rhythm of peasant life changed dramatically, adapting to the harsh laws of the dark season. Nature itself forced people to slow down considerably and radically change their usual daily schedule. And this brings us to the next striking fact about how life unfolded in a remote winter village. In our modern imagination, the life of a medieval peasant was filled with endless and grueling daily labor. We are sure that these poor people worked literally to exhaustion from the first rays of the sun until late at night. And this was indeed true, but only during the period from early warm spring to late rainy autumn. When the real winter cold set in and the fields were covered with a thick layer of snow, something amazing happened. Paradoxically, for the exhausted peasants, winter unexpectedly became a time of long-awaited and relatively peaceful rest. All the hard, exhausting fieldwork completely stopped for entirely objective natural reasons. It was physically impossible to plow the frozen hard ground, and sowing seeds in deep snow made no sense. Therefore, millions of people who had been breaking their backs in the fields just a month ago suddenly found themselves locked in their homes. A period of a kind of winter vacation began, when the physical load on the exhausted body decreased tenfold. Nature gave people a legitimate pause so that they could restore their depleted strength before the new hard spring. The main and most important daily duty in winter was the continuous and careful care of animals. The livestock locked inside the hut had to be regularly fed with hay prepared in advance and given clean water to drink. The lives of all the people in this small house depended directly on the well-being of these living heaters. Therefore, caring for a cow or horse was not perceived as a heavy burden, but as a sacred family duty. People could go hungry themselves, but they always gave the last armful of good hay to the animal that saved them from the cold. The most surprising thing is that the main deadly threat to peasants in winter was not the bitter cold outside. As we have already established, a live battery and a central hearth did an excellent job of heating a cramped room. The real and most terrible enemy, which slowly killed entire villages, was banal physical hunger. If the autumn harvest was too meager due to drought or rain, winter instantly turned into torture. Food supplies dwindled with each passing day, and people had to strictly ration every piece of hard bread they ate. Therefore, reducing physical activity was not just a pleasant bonus, but another ingenious survival strategy. Sitting in one place and doing light manual labor, peasants burned far fewer valuable calories. They behaved like bears in deep hibernation, slowing down their metabolism as much as possible during the hungry months. Less movement meant less energy expended, which meant that much less precious, scarce food was required. This biological economy often became a decisive factor in allowing people to hold out until the first spring greens appeared. Safe huts, those at the top of a society, suffered. Aristocrats in their giant, majestic castles faced a completely different, far more frightening set of winter problems. Despite their enormous wealth, they were paradoxically unable to provide themselves with a basic level of physical comfort. The castles that were supposed to protect them from any enemies turned into cruel killers in winter, and now we will see why $1 billion did not save them from freezing to death in their own bedrooms. Now let's leave the warm, smelly hut and move to the top of the hill, where a real stone castle stands proudly. This monumental structure would be worth more than $1 billion today, considering the amount of manual labor and materials involved. Tall towers, impregnable walls, huge halls, all of this screamed of the incredible power and wealth of the owner. It seems that a ruler capable of building such a fortress must live in conditions of absolute, unsurpassed climatic comfort. But the reality was that living in a castle in winter was like voluntarily locking yourself inside a giant freezer. The main problem lay in the very philosophy behind the design of any classic medieval castle. These colossal structures were built exclusively for fierce defense, and not at all for the cozy living of a family. Thick multi-meter stone walls did indeed provide excellent protection for the inhabitants from catapults, arrows, and enemy infantry. But the laws of physics are unforgiving. Stone has enormous heat capacity and is an ideal conductor of bitter cold. In winter, these giant stone structures froze through and began to literally suck the heat out of the interior. Due to the enormous size of the halls, it was impossible to use the method of a central fire, as clever peasants did. The heat would simply dissolve in the huge volume of cold air, rising to the unattainable 20-meter ceilings. Moreover, lighting an open fire on the expensive stone floor in the middle of the ceremonial hall was somehow unroyal. Therefore, the inhabitants of the castle were forced to look for completely different, much more complex and expensive engineering solutions. They had to spend colossal sums of money just to keep from freezing in their own home. Imagine that today you bought a luxury concrete bunker and are trying to heat it with a small electric hairdryer. That's roughly how hopeless the wealthy lords felt when trying to heat their cyclopean stone halls in winter. They wrapped themselves in expensive multi-layered furs, wore heavy woolen cloaks even at the dinner table, and were constantly cold. Winter for the aristocracy turned into an endless struggle with the huge stone monster they themselves had built. Their wealth allowed them to fence themselves off from enemy armies, but made them completely defenseless against the laws of thermodynamics. Therefore, the lords had to invent unique ways to insulate the icy walls from the living space of the castle, and it is here that a luxury item, which we today consider exclusively an element of high art, enters the historical scene. In order to survive in their stone refrigerators, the aristocrats had to hang incredibly expensive carpets on all the walls.
Truly wonderful.
We will discuss how this luxurious thermal insulation system worked in the next interesting chapter. It turns out that art in the Middle Ages was exclusively pragmatic and vitally important. Today we are used to seeing magnificent medieval tapestries exclusively in the sterile halls of famous world museums. We admire the delicate handiwork, detailed hunting scenes, and skill of the ancient weavers who spent years creating these masterpieces. It seems to us that these huge woven canvases were hung on the walls of castles solely for aesthetic pleasure and beauty. However, the truth is that beauty was only a pleasant and completely unnecessary side effect of their existence. The main and vital function of any tapestry was the banal but absolutely necessary thermal insulation of the room. The luxurious, heavy woven carpets functioned like huge woolen sweaters worn on the castle's icy stone walls. When a tapestry was hung on the wall, a protective layer of air was created between the thick fabric and the cold, frozen stone. This tiny zone of still air acted as an excellent insulator, preventing the stone from drawing heat out of the room. The temperature inside a room densely hung with tapestries could be several degrees higher than in a bare stone room. In the harsh winter conditions, those few degrees often meant the difference between life and death from pneumonia. The cost of these functional insulators was simply astronomical and completely unaffordable for the vast majority of people. It could take a team of professional craftsmen many years of painstaking work to create a single high-quality large tapestry. They cost a fortune, comparable to the price of a small modern yacht or a luxury private jet. Therefore, the number of tapestries in a castle directly indicated not only the impeccable taste of the owner, but also his financial power. It was the most expensive insulation in the world, which only kings and the highest European aristocracy could afford. Since they were so expensive, lords rarely had enough carpets to hang them in absolutely every room of the castle. Tapestries were hung only in those rooms where the ruler's family was at a given moment in time. When the lord moved from the living room to the bedroom, the servants often hurriedly removed the heavy carpets and carried them behind him. The owners literally carried their personal insulation with them throughout the huge freezing castle. It sounds funny, but it was an absolutely necessary logistical operation to maintain an acceptable body temperature. Modern builders use cheap fiberglass or high-tech polyurethane foam panels to insulate walls. They hide this ugly insulation material deep inside the wall so that no one will ever see it. In the Middle Ages, insulation was displayed prominently, cost millions, and was the main source of pride for the owner of the house. Your modern wall does the same physical work as a 16th century tapestry, but it looks terribly boring. This is a striking example of how harsh necessity forced people to create true masterpieces of immortal art. But even walls tightly wrapped in wool tapestries could not heat the huge rooms of the castle on their own. A powerful and constant source of heat was needed to counteract the icy reality outside. And here we come to the main engineering mistake of the medieval aristocracy, which made them freeze even more. Unlike the peasants, the lords solved the problem of smoke, but created a new, even more stupid problem for themselves. Let's take a look at why luxurious castle fireplaces were the most inefficient way of heating in human history. As we already know, ordinary peasants warmed themselves around an open fire in the very center of their cramped, smelly huts. The lords, of course, could not afford to sit on the floor in the smoke, choking on coughs in their expensive silk clothes. Therefore, the aristocracy began to use an innovative solution for that time: wall-mounted stone fireplaces with high chimneys. This great engineering invention finally solved the agonizing problem of suffocating smoke inside living quarters. The castle halls became clean, and it became easy to breathe. But this comfort came at a shocking energy cost. The classic medieval fireplace built into a cold wall turned out to be a fantastically inefficient heating device. The physics of the process was such that the enormous draft inside the pipe literally sucked all the smoke upward. But along with the smoke, absolutely all the useful heat from the burning wood flew out of the chimney at breakneck speed. Modern heating engineers have calculated that old wall-mounted fireplaces lost between 70 and 80% of the energy they produced. In essence, the lords burned entire forests of expensive wood solely to heat the winter streets. In order to keep warm in such paradoxical conditions, the inhabitants of the castle had to sit practically right next to the raging fire. Heat was transmitted only by direct radiation, so taking a step back instantly returned you to the zone of piercing icy cold. This created a comical and cruel situation. Your face literally burned from the unbearable heat of the flames, while your back was covered with frost. The huge hall remained icy, and the saving zone of comfort was limited to a tiny patch within a 2-meter radius of the fireplace. A peasant's bonfire warmed the whole house, while the royal fireplace could barely warm one person sitting next to it. But the real horror began in the evening, when the lords had to leave their safe armchairs by the fireplace and go to bed. The fire in the bedroom could go out at night, and then the temperature in the huge stone room would rapidly drop to 0. Sleeping in a giant refrigerator without cows and pigs nearby was no easy task, even for kings. Therefore, the aristocrats had to come up with another ingenious solution to survive until the next cold morning. And this solution turned their beds into complex engineering structures with their own microclimate. When the heavy oak doors of the castle closed for the night, the huge halls quickly turned into real ice caves. The temperature inside the richly decorated royal bedroom in winter could easily drop to a frightening 0 degrees. Sleeping outdoors in such unbearable conditions meant waking up in the morning with severe pneumonia. And since it was physically impossible to heat the entire gigantic room, the aristocrats decided to heat only the place where they slept. It was for this extreme survival that the famous huge beds with high canopies were invented. Today we view these massive wooden structures with carved posts as a romantic symbol of royal luxury. We hang light, semi-transparent tulle over our beds solely for beauty and to create a pleasant, intimate atmosphere in the bedroom. But in the Middle Ages, these massive heavy curtains made of velvet or thick wool had nothing to do with romance. They served a purely utilitarian function. At night, they were tightly drawn on all 4 sides, creating an airtight box. This enclosed bed was transformed into a tiny, protected, warm tent set right in the middle of a huge icy hall. Inside this fabric box, a unique microclimate was created, completely isolated from the rest of the room. The heat from the human body did not dissipate into the high ceilings of the castle, but was reliably retained by thick woolen curtains. But sometimes natural human warmth was not enough to warm the icy sheets before bedtime. Therefore, the servants had to carry out a complex operation in advance to artificially heat the royal bed. Bricks heated on the fireplace were carefully placed in the bed, wrapped in thick cloth so as not to burn the feet. A more complex technological solution was special metal pans with long handles filled with hot charcoal. The maids slowly moved these dangerous pans between the cold sheets to warm the fabric at least a little before the lord's arrival. It was an extremely risky daily procedure, as a single accidental spark could instantly burn the entire bed to the ground. But the fear of lying down in a freezing cold bed was much stronger than the fear of accidentally starting a nighttime fire in the castle. Modern electric blankets do exactly the same job, only without the risk of burning alive. Some particularly heat-loving aristocrats use live, biological heaters inside their canopies for extra comfort. They took several small hunting dogs with them under a thick blanket, which radiated animal heat perfectly. It's funny, but at that moment, the highest aristocracy was actually copying the very same peasant method of survival with pigs. The only difference was in the breed of animals and the fact that all this took place on silk sheets worth $1 million. The laws of survival forced both the dirty peasant and the powerful king to huddle close to a warm dog. In the morning, the process of leaving this warm cocoon turned into a real psychological nightmare for any resident of the castle. You had to pull back the thick, protective curtains and step into a room where the water in the jug had frozen overnight. This daily temperature shock was excellent training for the character, but it ruined the health of the richest people of the time. Their billion-dollar castle could not provide them with even the basic morning comfort that any school child has today. And this proves once again that technological progress is much more important for the quality of life than gold bars in the basement. However, tent beds and expensive tapestries were far from the most absurd things in the winter life of the upper nobility. There was one item that the lords valued so much that they literally refused to part with it, even when traveling. This item cost a fortune, was incredibly fragile, but without it, winter in the castle became completely unbearable. And the way the aristocrats treated this thing sounds like an absolutely crazy and ridiculous comedy of manners today. Let's move on to the last fact about how the rich transported their windows in their luggage. As we discussed in detail earlier, ordinary peasants used cloudy cow horns to somehow cover their windows in winter. For wealthy aristocrats in the classical Middle Ages, there was already a real, transparent glass window that let in normal light. However, the production of flat window glass at that time was an incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and insanely expensive technological process. Glass windows were such an extravagant luxury that their cost exceeded the price of some small surrounding villages and their inhabitants. They were a symbol of the absolute, unattainable status and fantastic financial power of the owner. Due to such shocking costs, even the richest dukes and kings could not afford to glaze all their numerous castles. Most of the windows in the fortresses were closed with ordinary heavy wooden shutters, which plunged the rooms into darkness, just like those of the peasants. Glass frames were ordered individually and installed only in the most important ceremonial halls and the Lord's private chambers. And this is where the most interesting and insane manifestation of medieval economic logic begins, which is difficult for modern people to understand. The lords perceived these windows not as part of a stationary building, but as their precious personal portable property. In winter, the nobility never stayed in one place. They constantly moved from one castle to another. This was done in order not to deplete food supplies in one particular area during the long winter. And when a powerful lord was about to leave his castle, he gave his servants one quite astonishing order. He ordered them to carefully remove the precious glass frames from the stone openings and pack them carefully in their luggage. The windows were literally loaded onto carts along with clothes, dishes, and gold to be taken to a new winter residence. Imagine the absurdity of this complex logistical operation through the eyes of a modern city dweller. You move to your country house for the winter, but instead of simply closing the door of your apartment, you dismantle all the plastic double-glazed windows. You load them into the trunk of your car and take them with you to insert into the empty openings at your warm country house. In the Middle Ages, this was an absolutely normal and routine practice for people with enormous power. Leaving windows in an empty castle meant exposing them to the risk of theft or damage from strong winter winds. Of course, transporting fragile glass along the terrible bumpy roads of the time was an incredibly risky undertaking. Wagons shook on the stones, luggage fell into the mud, and every journey could end with the clink of $1 million fortune shattered. To preserve the glass, it was tightly packed with soft straw and expensive fabrics and entrusted to the most reliable soldiers for protection. If a window did break, it was a real financial tragedy, even for a very wealthy noble family. Glass was valued more than gold coins because it provided light and protected against icy drafts. Against the backdrop of this crazy royal fuss, peasant windows made of boiled cow horns suddenly begin to look like a very practical solution. Peasants did not need to hire guards for their cloudy windows, and they certainly did not carry them around in a bag. The rich became hostages to their own expensive technologies, spending enormous effort on maintaining a status symbol piece of glass. The poor, on the other hand, found a free, reliable, and ingeniously simple solution right in the backyard of their dirty huts. This proves once again that when it comes to extreme survival, simplicity and accessibility always trump complex and fragile luxury. Summing up this amazing historical comparison, we see a completely different picture of the past than what we are shown in the movies. The billion-dollar castle turned out to be a giant ice trap, requiring enormous effort just to keep from freezing. The rich had to hang carpets on the walls, hide in tent beds, and carry glass windows with them in carts. Their life in winter was an endless and expensive struggle against the laws of physics, in which they often tragically lost. Luxury did not guarantee warmth at all. It only made the process of freezing more aesthetic and visually impressive. On the other hand, the $1 peasant hut, despite its terrible smell and thick smoke, turned out to be a masterpiece of efficiency. A living biological battery of cows, central heating, and horn windows allowed the poor to survive at minimal cost. They understood the laws of nature and used them to their advantage, creating an ideal system for extreme winter survival. As a result, in a fierce battle with the medieval winter, the smelly hut won a decisive victory over the beautiful stone palace. It turns out that sometimes dirt and sticks keep you warm much better than a crown and $1 billion in your pocket.